Welcome to the 57th episode of the Flip Learning Network podcast. I'm your host, Troy Cockrum. Today I have on the show Jason Bretzmann, and we're going to talk about a new book out called Flipping 2.0. Jason, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, Troy, and everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm Jason Bretzmann. I am a high school teacher in Muskego, Wisconsin, at Muskego High School. I teach AP Government and Politics, and I'm flipping my classes.
And so just this week was a book came out called Flipping 2.0, Practical Strategies. I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. Practical Applications for Flipping Your Class. And it is compiled by Jason with several chapters by a variety of different authors. Can you give us a general introduction of the book before we get into specific chapters?
Sure. Well, it's Flipping 2.0, Practical Strategies for Flipping Your Class. I think you had it right the first time. We went through various different ideas for the names, but what we set out to do was take this idea of flipping your class. A lot of people gave a lot of credit to Aaron Sams and John Bergman and others for what they were doing, and we said, well, let's talk about how we can actually do it. In other words, once you've decided to flip, how do I get it done? What will I do in class? What will it look like outside of class? What technology do I need? And of course, Troy was involved and wrote a great chapter. We call it the Google interlude because we didn't know exactly where to put it, so it's sort of in the middle. Google uses for the flipped classroom, and so we're talking in the book different disciplines, different grade levels, different geographical makeup of the authors throughout the book, talking about, well, how did they do it? And so that's really the focus of the book, to help people, help teachers who are thinking about flipping, and give them some practical strategies on how to do it.
And how many pages did the book end up being?
I think 326 with a couple extra acknowledgments and things like that. So it's quite the tome.
So let's. I'm looking at the list of authors here. We have Brian Bennett, which if you followed Flip Learning, you should know Brian Bennett. Former science teacher. He's now working for TechSmith, but he did a chapter on mastery learning. Can you tell us a little bit about that chapter?
Sure. After a really good forward from Aaron Sams, that first chapter we wanted to talk about mastery. And so he looks at it from the perspective of a science teacher, and he takes us through the years, literally years, that it took him to go to a mastery level. So he's talking about in his class how people were, students were working on Spanish. What is a science class? Well, his theory is that the best use of face-to-face time. So if he's got students who can work on their chemistry and get it completed and show mastery of it, then he says, well, maybe a good idea for them is to also utilize one of those opportunities for developing those soft skills of time management, things like that. And if they decide that the best use of their face-to-face time in that class is to talk to the other kids in their Spanish class and try to learn the stuff that they're not learning there, then that's what he allows to have happen. Not everybody's quite there yet, but he does push the envelope, talk about mastery. And he also goes through, like I said, that process that he went through of the learning objectives and what were the uses of video and how did it sort of evolve into the videos there not to teach you, but the videos there if you need that extra help. If you got it, why spend your time watching the video? If you've mastered it, then move on and you can go deeper and go into something else. So it's a really interesting and challenging chapter to start the book off with. But that's why, one of the reasons we call it Flipping 2.0. Maybe a better title would have been Moving Toward Flipping 2.0, because that's what this book is going to help people do.
Yeah, and I was realizing as you were talking that maybe I should have backed up a little bit and talked more about the title. I like to call them second iteration flips. I feel like every teacher starts out with a basic flip and then moves to a more intricate or more advanced flip. And mastery is one of the second iterations, and explore, flip, apply, and peer instruction are some of the other second iterations. So, just, can you talk a little bit more about how the title came about of the book?
Well, I think first of all, we can go back even further. It was that hashtag flip class where I started going, and I believe Brian started that, or at least I know
He
he
did,
was.
yes, actually, he did.
Okay, and he was moderating it, and so I went there and lurked and looked and learned, and eventually asked a question, and eventually started contributing, and at the same time I was thinking, wow, it'd be great if more people had access to this, and we know Twitter is a great tool, but not everybody's there. So we thought, well, what if we can put this all into a book and get this out to even more people who aren't on Twitter? And so, in a sense, it started there, and then with Cheryl Morris and Andrew Thomason continuing that chat. But when people are chatting, they tend to talk about flipping 101, whatever terminology you want to use, but flipping 101 is kind of like that entry level. Homework homework that used to be outside of class is now in class, and vice versa. But a lot of people started saying, well, that's not good enough. That's a great starting place. And then they started, thinking about talking about, well, what does the next iteration look like? What is flipping 2.0? And it doesn't follow logically, right? Flipping 101 and flipping 2.0, but that's the way people started talking about it. And so we wanted to sort of take that title, take that idea, and help people who even want to start out flipping, but eventually move toward that, flipping 2.0, that mastery level, that best use of face-to-face time, student-centered learning, and some people call it flipped learning.
And so, let's see, you did mention Cheryl Morris and Andrew Thomason, and they wrote a chapter on English, as well as Kate Baker wrote a chapter on English. What do you can you tell us about those chapters?
Well, first of all, they're English teachers, so it's really well written. It's they take you through a story, and they really tell the story of their flipped learning. And Andrew and Cheryl collaborate on their chapter, and then they write another chapter in the second section of the book called "Can Anybody Flip?" And they talk about collaboration, because I'm sure, well, I know that they collaborated across the country. So Cheryl is in California, and Andrew is in North Carolina, and they essentially team teach their classes using Google Hangouts and other technology. So they collaborate on the lessons and all that kind of stuff. But Kate and those two wrote chapters on English, and we start off that first section, first with mastery, but then the four common or the four core disciplines. So we start off with English, and then social studies, and then I think it's math, and then science. So we have 2 chapters on each of those, and I really like the English chapters, like I said, because they're really well written, and they tell the story, and there's really some good insight there. Kate Baker, for example, talks about one of the reasons, or one of the ways she was able to use flipping was to give more time in class to do, I think it was Romeo and Juliet, where she said, I was having students read, act out, and try to understand Romeo and Juliet all at the same time. And I just thought that, the way she says it is, well, how can we expect them to do that? We need to have them read it. We need to have them, act it out so they get, that part of it, but also understand it in sort of at separate times. So she was, putting some of that outside of class, and it allowed more time to really understand it in class. So it's some really good stuff there.
Yeah, and I actually, Kate gave me a couple of her lessons that I've used in my book. So she's got some great English stuff and does things a little bit differently than I do. So I was able to get some great lessons from her to put in mine. So I know she knows her stuff.
Yeah, she sure does. And I believe she teaches in a classroom with another teacher. So she is moving stuff around and trying to do the best for her students, and also navigating and doing that that process where you have to almost ask for permission from that other adult in the group.
And I know she also has department um, mandated how long she spends on a unit. So her and I have talked in the past about her Romeo and Juliet unit, and she gets through the book much faster, but she still has to spend the exact same amount of time that the other teachers do with it. So she's able to go a lot deeper because she has, whereas she might have taken a month previously to get through it, now she can get through it in 2 weeks and do uh, a lot more in-depth activities and a lot more deeper thinking than the
Right,
other
right.
teachers do.
And that's probably another part of Flipping 2.0 that we should mention, that the idea that you can go a lot deeper and you can do a lot more critical thinking and analysis and creation uh, because of the flipping that you're doing.
And then the social studies chapters, you wrote one, and Carl and Lindgren Stryker wrote one, and those are Carl's been on the show before with me, and can you tell us about those chapters?
Yeah, sure. Carl teaches world history to some younger students than I do. I have mostly juniors and seniors teaching AP government. So it's a nice, perspective from sort of different ends of the spectrum. But Carl writes about how, again, his process and his conversation, of kind of being where he's at and then continuing to move forward. He includes some student comments in his chapter, which I think is really good because, as I said to him, I'm like, hey, uh, your focus is student-centered classroom, and his is a mastery. What does he call it? It's sort of mastery-like, where it's asynchronous, where he has learning objectives, and then students need to talk with him, and they need to check off their mastery of the learning before they can move on, before they can do the assessment. So he's got, students sort of all over the place exploring what they need to explore, and it sounds like a really dynamic place to be, and he sort of gives us an idea of how to get to that point. In my chapter, I ask questions. How comfortable are you with this? Can you give up the lecture? If so, how are you going to do that? And I sort of, challenge the social studies teacher to ask the questions and then try to answer them. And then I give examples of how I've answered them along the way. Because I thought I was pretty good at the lecture, and I had the silly walks and the goofy things going on, and it's just that I think over the 6 or 7 years that I was teaching AP government, I started to see that my students were different, and they were different from where I started teaching in 1997. And so the PowerPoint, the lecture, even as engaging as it was, it just wasn't doing it anymore. And for me, boy, one of the first weeks, we had video, and we had reading the chapter outside of class. It's an AP class, so that there's a lot of stuff you got to do. But in class, we started the conversation. And so my students had small groups. They had what I call the IQs, the interesting questions. In order to start the conversation, everybody had to come to class in their small group with an interesting question, which is defined as something that you don't know the answer to, that's content related. So it jumpstarts the conversation. And so I came to this one group, and they were talking about how, what would happen if we had a war between the states. And of course, I said, well, didn't we already have that? And they said, no, no, we don't mean between different, sections of the country. All the states fighting with each other, because the beginning part was, why do we have government? So they're talking about, well, what if we didn't have government, and what if we were all fighting with each other? And so here we were in the first week of school, talking about sectionalism, and it led to a conversation about red states and blue states, and different demographic and geographic makeup of the country. And so this is something we don't usually get to till March. And here they, in relation to why do we have government, they went down the path in the first week of school talking about, all these different concepts that we normally wouldn't get to till later. And it was relevant to them because they brought it up. It was their conversation, and so that's something that they could remember, because it was real for them. So I get excited about this stuff when I just start talking, because it's real learning going on in my class, and that's what I like about this. And that's something that Carl talks about too, the idea of what he wanted his class to be, and that's sort of where we start our chapters. What he even asked, what do you want your ideal classroom to look like? And so, okay, now let's go create that. And my answer to that is I wanted real discussion. I wanted, an authentic, content-related conversation about social studies, and we figured out a way to get that. And that's what my students go on to talk about. Is they construct meaning for each of the learning objectives, and then as a group they have to relate each learning objective to something else in another chapter, because in all things, but especially in government politics, it's not in a vacuum in one chapter, and then they have to relate it to current events. So how does this, highfalutin concept on government politics relate to what's actually going on? So another connection. And then they show mastery a bunch of different ways. And in my class, they got to take a test. And it's because it's an AP class. We want to practice.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. Then we got Audrey McLaren and John Stevens that did the math chapters. I've met Audrey a couple of times, but I know John, but I've never met John. Can you tell us more about these chapters?
Yeah. Well, John's chapter is really an effective chapter for math teachers and people who don't understand math. Which is to say that I was able to understand his chapter. Audrey, she's spectacular, and I could understand the stuff that she was explaining, and I feel a little bit selfish in all these chapters, Audrey's included, that I've read the book many times now through different proofs, but I've been able to take something out from all of these chapters, and preparing to use it. So even as a social studies teacher, there's a lot of good stuff in the math chapters, but Audrey talks about how she goes through flip ages. So you call them iterations, she calls them ages, and the different process, and it's an ongoing process for her. And she includes a lot of different math stuff, where the math teacher will read it and go, oh, I could take that and I could apply that. That's a really good strategy for my class. I'm about the words that she says, but there's also a lot of math stuff she says. And John, he talks about the way he's done it, and he has an extra emphasis on how this has really allowed him to build relationships with his students, and how he's gone from just a couple of minutes of math, in math instruction, and to lots more time. And He takes it through, we do the introduction and we do the questions and we do the, somebody has to go to the office or whatever, and then we get to do only a little bit of math instruction where students need it. And so he says with flipping, he's able to do some of those things outside of class so that in class he can go and talk with each of those students, figure out where they're at, and figure out how to help each of them move forward. So the learners that are challenged, he can bring them along, and those who can sort of speed through it, he helps them move along too. It's a really a good look into his classroom and how things have changed and how he's able to talk to each student every day.
And I'm already hearing some common themes. And I've always thought we do need to be careful to not compartmentalize based on content area, because just because you flip math doesn't mean it's really all that much different than flipping an English class. Just the content is different, but a lot of the common elements stay together, and it's relationships, it's being able to talk to every student, it's being able to dig deeper and have great conversations, and I think those are common in every flip class.
Absolutely. And like I said, the social studies teacher is going to go to those chapters first, probably. But yeah, if you read the whole book, you're getting a lot of good stuff from everybody's chapter. Mm-hmm.
And then I know there's a lot of stuff on science already out there, but you included 2 science chapters anyways. David Prindle and Mark Siegel, and I've had Mark Siegel on the show before as well. Can you tell us about their chapters?
Yeah, it's a who's who of flipping, isn't it? Well, David takes his focus. David from Michigan, he takes his focus more on at-risk students, and he even talks about one of his students with autism and the challenges that were posed there, and how flipping was able to help. But yeah, his focus is on the challenge of at-risk students and how this flipping that he did allowed more differentiation and allowed him to meet each student's needs, which is really kind of a neat thing to read. So it's not just like my students in an AP class, that many of them are motivated to learn and come to school every day, and David's got a different group, and so he used flipping to reach them. And Mark, he talks about the technology integration that he did. He talks about how he sort of transitioned because he didn't see what he wanted to see in his science students. He wanted them to be thinkers, and he wanted them to be able to do this stuff on their own. And so he goes through a process explaining how he just by changing a few things, including the sign on his door. I'll let you read about that good story, but he changed the sign on his door to make it not his class, but to make it the collective classroom of everybody there. And so it was more student-centered, more learner-centered than welcome to my class where I'm going to tell you things. And he goes through that process too.
And he had a tough road to go at the beginning because the school he was at he got a lot of resistance, and he ended up having to change schools in order to really implement the flip the way he wanted to do it.
And I think not everybody had that experience, but I think that a lot of what we're talking about here is teachers in their situations who wrote in this book are coming up with a way to help their students learn, and that's what the bottom line for this is. And it may not work for everybody, it may not work in every situation, but I would say that that there are strategies here to help. And it's like what we do as teachers. We steal the good stuff and make it our own, and then we say, oh, okay, I don't like that thing that he's talking about or she's talking about. We'll just leave that there or share it with somebody else. But it's really, for Mark and everybody, it's about, well, how can I, in this situation with these students, help them learn and be learners.
And then we get into those were the content areas. There's others. We have two on technology by Corey Pepler, and then a combined Tom Driscoll and Brian Germain, and then mine on using Google Apps and different Google tools. Can you talk a little bit about those chapters?
Sure. Yeah, Corey closes out the book, and he talks about teacher technology use. And so at the end of the book, he says, first of all, take it easy. There's 300 and whatever pages of really good information. You don't have to do it today. And technology-wise, you don't have to be an expert today. And he says, just start somewhere, and here's a couple of tips. And so he goes through sort of a list of tips and best practices for technology use for teachers. And then he sort of connects the beginning of the book to the end, the Aaron Sams forward to his conclusion, I guess you could say. But then we have the Google interlude, as I called it before, and as I told you after your draft, I said everything that you expect to be there is there, and then some. And so it's Google Forms, Google Docs, some about scripts like Flubaroo and what is it, Formamule?
Formula, yeah.
Yep. And so how you and other teachers have used the Google Apps for Education, that whole, I call it sweet Google, that whole Google thing to help manage the workflow and stay connected with students outside of class. And so it's a great, I think your chapter is a great place to start with using Google in the flip class or any class for that matter. Even if you're not flipping your class, you should get a copy of this book just for that chapter.
Well, I think for me, I try to, since we're already a Google Apps school, because I see great websites and different cloud tools and things all the time that I would like to use, but I'm weary of creating too many sign-ins and remembering where to go because some of your students can manage it, but if a student has some attention issues or if a student already has trouble completing their work, having them try to remember 3 different passwords and different places to go can cause confusion, and so I try to keep everything inside of Google as much as possible, just because one, they make it so intuitive. Most of their products are pretty intuitive, and my students then have a single sign-on and don't have to worry about multiple accounts, and so that's why I like to use Google. It's not necessarily they don't always have the best product, but if Google has a version of something I like to use, then I try to stick within Google.
That's a good point. In some of the professional development we were doing this summer, we had questions about that. If we're going to use all these different tools, well, how are my students going to remember all of those passwords? And that's a good point. Here you got one that you need.
Right.
Let me interview you for a second here about your chapter. What's the most important point about Google, or maybe you already said it, but what's the most important thing that people should consider about your chapter at Google and why to use it?
I think it's the simplicity. The Google's goal is to make everything intuitive and to make it simple, and make it work the best way that it can work. And so nearly all the Google products that I introduce to my students, they pick up very quickly because it's across platforms or across different tools, the operations are the same. The interface is very similar, and it's, at least in my class, it's changed our culture. Whereas last year we used a website called Storybird that I wanted to try out, and my students were, instead of saying, they were saying, how can they share this with me? so it's changed sort of the way they think, and they're now thinking as sharing as opposed to sending this or distributing, or they're using the same terminology that Google uses because that's become so natural for them. Um,
That's a
and
big
so
shift.
that's really, I would say, um, the biggest thing, especially in a flipped class, it's a shift for the kids to figure out how to do a lot of the things. It's not just a change for the teacher, but the students have to figure out how to do a lot of things differently. And I like to say, I like to eliminate every excuse that I can for them to not do their work. And one of the ways I do that is to not let technology get in the way. And Google helps with that because I mean there's certain things that I don't like the way they've set things up. I think Sites is still a little bit too difficult to use, and I had a teacher come to me this week, and she said that she was told by another teacher to use a Weebly account because it was easier. And I said, for you, Weebly probably would be easier. Um, but I use Google Sites because I know how to use it, and I like how I can embed different Google products into it and things like that. But I think Google still has a little way to go with the intuitiveness of Sites, but with Docs and um, Drive and anything else, Sheets is getting better. Presentations I use all the time, and then Forms. Forms is a gem that I think most people don't utilize or don't know a lot about, but can really automate a lot of different things you do in your class that I've found very beneficial. So I think Google
Absolutely.
makes Google has a lot of great ideas. Um, they're not as vocal about promoting them. I don't think they're almost you have to find them or hear of somebody else who's using them.
Right, right.
Um, and
Uh,
so that's I think the benefit of what you would see in my chapters. You might find some tools in Google you didn't even know were there, and they're a simple click that you just didn't see.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And Mark Siegel, he presented on that at FlipCon last summer as well, and he talks a little bit about that in his chapter. And I use Flubaroo, uh, what you talk about in your chapter, Flubaroo script, and so my students, took the test, and before they were leaving on their way out, they were checking on their phone what the grade was, and they just really thought that was, a great thing. I use that as a formative and then as a summative assessment, but it was this immediate feedback. And you can do that. You
yeah,
don't have to take your Scantron and walk down to the teacher's lounge and come back the next day. It's immediate, click, 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 and they get it. So,
and the one of the things that I'm was a bit apprehensive about is almost any technology you write about almost immediately it's changed, but
hmm
more so with Google as they change things so quickly, and sometimes the changes are great, sometimes they're so small you don't even notice the change, and sometimes they're different enough that you're like, why did they bother to change this? I like the way it was. But I already used Formule this week, and I had always used Formule with forms. And this week, I was looking for a way to send out when my students do discussion. I wanted to send a quick email at the end of the day that said, "You contributed enough to the discussion, or you did not contribute enough, and here's a document you can go to and contribute more to the discussion." Um, and I was sitting there thinking about how I wanted to do it, and I just decided to use Formule, but I just created a spreadsheet, and I skipped the form part of the process altogether. And and I set up the script for Formule, but I never set up a form. I just go in manually and type in, I just put a yes or a no for my records, and then that converts that to you've done you contributed enough or you didn't contribute enough, and then it sends the email, a custom email to the student to tell them what they need to do and if they want to get more credit for the discussion. So
Wow.
that's the good and the bad about Google is it's constantly changing. The bad is there's some things in my book that that are that chapter that I would have loved to have added, but it was already done.
That's second edition.
Yeah.
And the ebook will be coming out in the next couple of weeks too. Maybe you can do some adjustments there. Let me just mention Tom Driscoll and Brian Germain too, because
Okay.
they had a great chapter on using technology. Um, Social studies teachers, and but we asked them to write about technology, and so they talk about integrating and making it this sort of seamless transition and giving some real good tools that you can use in order to more effectively have your out of class and your in class stuff work for the flip class. It's a really good chapter, and they share a couple of pictures of their students engaged in the process, and that you can really tell that the students are engaged and they are doing authentic, genuine learning and work, and they really describe well what they did and how they did it, and how it's not about the technology, but the technology can be used in a seamless way. So it's learning while you're using technology, as opposed to let's make a Prezi because Prezis are cool.
And Prezis are cool, but they take forever to make, so that's why I stopped making them. And then we've got Todd. I don't even know how to say his last name. Nesloni, is that correct?
Yep.
Doing elementary, and then Nicole Carter doing middle school flipped. And I had Nicole on the podcast last week. So.
Oh, good. Yeah. Again, there are some people who say, well, okay, I get this for some of your classes. I get this for a college class, but this probably can't work in middle school or grade school. Well, Todd and Nicole sort of dispel that myth, and they explain exactly what they've done and how they've done it, and they give specific tools and anecdotes of what they did and how it accomplished what they had set out to do. And Todd talks about this math fair that he had, and it was the most powerful story for him, the most powerful learning experience for his students, and it got more than anything, he said, in his school, it got parents to show up and participate. So really inspirational stuff from them. Nicole goes through in really great detail on what she did and how she did it, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention Crystal Kirch and her blog, Flipping with Kirch.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the authors give her a lot of credit for sort of in a distance education kind of a way, helping them with her whisk and how they sort of applied that in their class and helped them do it more effectively. And Nicole explains how she had her students using the whisk.
And then
Should we explain what the whisk is?
we can. I have had Crystal on. Actually, I've had her on the show twice, but the whisk is her feedback form. I mean, it's the simple definitions or feedback form, and it stands for watch, summarize, and question is what WSQ is. Even though it's pronounced whisk, it's WSQ. And it's just a simple way to create a feedback for the video so that, I mean, I think probably a lot of common elements in the chapters were you need to have some sort of interaction with the video. You can't just send them home to watch the video and expect it to sink in.
Right.
And Crystal does a great job of getting feedback from the students and creating a reflection process that works in a classroom. And so.
Yeah, and Nicole talks about how she used that as that feedback form to as I say in my chapter, as teachers we need proof, And so, what's the proof that you did something? And so, a lot of people have used that form, and others, who are thinking about flipping, they ask, well, how do you make sure, and how do you get students,
Hmm.
to watch the video? And the whisk is one way to do it. My students take Cornell notes, and there are a variety of things that you can do, having things embedded into using the Google products, right?
Hmm.
Embedded into videos, and so on and so forth.
And we have Heather Witten, who's been on the podcast as well, talking about world languages, which is still a very, I mean, English was, this summer seemed to be the start of the tipping point for English. World languages still hasn't seemed to catch on. There's still not a lot of world languages flippers out there. But talk a little bit about what Heather does.
Well, she again takes us through her journey, and she tells us about why she started flipping, and she says she's got to do all this stuff. She's got to get through all this content, all this vocabulary, and she felt like she wasn't getting any sort of connection to the culture and anything else. It was just a lot of memorization and that kind of thing. And at the same time, the requirements from the national group, I don't know the name of it for world languages, but they say you should have, I think it's 90% of the in-class time should be in the target language. So for her, the chapter applies to all the languages, but she's a Spanish teacher, and so she's saying, well, I want it to be authentic. I want students to be learning at deep levels, and I want them to be using the target language. How do I do that? And so she came across flipping, and she started doing it. And so now, I mean, she's got great videos where she's, instead of just using the words, she's telling stories in the videos about a kid and the shoes, and you have to read it. It's really interesting, but it's about how the differences between using por and para, and so she tells this story and goes through it, and then when the students come to class, they have to have a conversation about it, and they have to show their learning in class, and so it's not just a bunch of vocabulary on video and come to class and do something else. She really takes you through the story of her flip class, and it's really some authentic stuff going on. I mean, it's one of the many classes that when I read all the different chapters, I'm like, I want to be in that class. I want to I want to go and do this. I want to learn Spanish again. So yeah, and it's there's a flip. I think it's Flip Lang. Is that the hashtag that they're using now? And they're starting to chat, and so it's taken off, and Heather had a seminar that she did a couple of weeks ago, and she loves to talk about
Hmm.
flipping, and she loves to talk about Spanish. So everybody should have her in for a day of learning, do some professional development.
Well, I know. For me, when I was at FlipCon, gosh, they all run together after a while. I think it was 3 years ago. There were three English flippers, and then the next year there was like 30, and then the next year there was like 300. And this summer, to me, it seemed to really blow up. And now, really, I mean, percentage-wise, it's still a very, very small number of overall teachers are flipping in general. But I got a lot of questions emailed to me, and a lot of people contacted me on Twitter for English flipping, and it really started to seems to really be picking up. And I know Heather and I have talked quite often about that, and she's really vocal trying to get foreign language teachers to flip, and um, it still seems to be a little bit slower to catch on, but I think it's getting there.
Mhm. Well, and that sort of segues into one of the chapters about flipping that Kenny Bosch wrote about the part-time flipping. And his point is, uh, you may be thinking about flipping, but you may not want to go all in
Hmm.
right now. And he says, well, how about a lesson? And actually, great time to do that, September 6th, right?
Yeah, it is
That's coming up, and that's
two
the
weeks.
Flip Learning Day, where Aaron Sams and John Bergman are encouraging everybody to flip one lesson, and that's what Kenny talks about. And he says, you don't have to do everything all the time, and this might be sort of the gateway for you to do that if you want to, end up there. And so he gives sort of strategies on, you could do this lesson, this unit, this one thing, and he talks about a bunch of different things that he did, and he's got a really energized, participatory classroom, and so it sort of runs into, even when he's not flipping things, there's all kinds of engagement, and people are, students are buying into the learning process. I think one more point there is that, this might not be for everybody right now, but there are some strategies in the book that are just about good teaching, whether
Hmm.
it's flipping part-time or whether it's the technology to use or the Google apps or anything like that. And, flipping is not the same definition for everybody. And so you look at these different authors and these different disciplines and geographical areas and different levels, and everybody's doing it a little bit differently, and that's okay. And that's sort of another theme in this book, is there is no single set definition for how you have to, right? That's not the name of the book. This is how you have to flip. It's, these are ideas. Take what works for you and make it about student-centered learning, higher level thinking, and best use of face-to-face time. Do what works for you and your students.
And John and Aaron, in their first book, their second book should be coming out soon, but their first book, towards the end, they even say, take what you've learned from us, and I forget the exact wording they use, but take what you've learned from us and modify it to fit your needs. And so
Right on.
that's what I say is one of the reasons there are so many versions of what flipping is because John and Aaron said, take it and run with it.
And that, if I had to point to one single factor that allowed me to flip, it's that. And I talk about that in my chapter, that they said, do what works for you and your students. Because I was thinking, math teachers do it this way, science teachers do it this way, but how am I going to do it? And my students are AP students. They got to read the book. How am I going to do, replace the book with a bunch of videos? That doesn't work. And they kept saying, do what makes sense, do what works. And I said, well, reading the book and watching the videos makes sense in my class, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what they do. And it sort of gave me the license to go out there and decide what do I want my class to look like, and what do I want my students to do, and they give you a license to try that. And I think our book, Flipping 2.0, gives people more of the concrete examples and strategies, and try it this way, see if it works.
And then we can't forget Kristen Daniels. She's been on the podcast twice. She's a huge, she's on the board of the Flip Learning Network, so she's really does a lot to promote flip learning, and she does a chapter on flipping your professional development. So tell us about that.
It's phenomenal. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. It's phenomenal. If you remember, I mentioned that I wanted to be in these teachers' classes. As I was reading the first incarnation of her chapter, I wrote a note to her, to me, I don't know who, but I said, I want to work in this district. I want to learn here, because she has essentially an IEP, if you will. She calls it, I think, an independent learning plan for each teacher. So the teacher who needs to learn how to add Google scripts to their, Google Forms and leverage that technology, she's got something for them. For the teacher who says, now which one's the mouse and how do I use it, she's got something for them. So she's not talking to this, the teacher who needs to know where the mouse is and saying, well, you take your Google form and you apply this script, and she's not doing that, because that's in essence wasting everybody's time.
Mm-hmm.
She's doing the flipping where she's got the forms, and you fill out the forms, and it's individualized, it's differentiated. Imagine that, differentiated professional development, differentiated learning, and so then you can, as a teacher, you can take where you're at and try to move forward. And so she's the coach then who puts groups of people together and allows them to learn together, but also create something for them. If they need a video on how to do the forms and Flubaroo, then she's going to create that and then support that in person. And if you need to know how to use the mouse, then she's going to create that video for that group of people and then support that in person. And it's just, it makes so much sense. So you're not broadcasting to the entire group now and saying, okay, everybody, take out your mouse. We're going to go through the different features, and wasting some people's time. And it's directed, it's differentiated, and it makes a whole lot of sense. And the flipping allows her to make that happen because she can create the videos outside of class. She can, support in person and really do the application and the movement forward in person. And it's just really exciting to see that. The technology helps her do it, but also the mindset of flipped learning helps her do it. And boy, if it's good enough for students, she'll be good enough for we teachers too, right?
Yeah, I think
Us teachers, we teachers. Come on, English guide, help me out here.
it will be us teachers.
Okay, thought so.
I think that's. I hear a lot of people saying that they say, well, gosh, couldn't we flip professional development? But they can't quite put a finger on how to do it. And I think Kristen Daniels a figure. So it seems like I'm looking at my list and I didn't leave anybody out. So I think, and not just because I'm involved with one of the chapters, but I think can be a great resource for teachers that are looking for more information on flipping, but also advanced flippers who want to see how other people do it. So where can the listeners find you, and where can they find the book?
Well, I encourage everybody to show up to the hashtag FlipClass chat on Monday nights. There's a lot of flipping conversation going on there. And I can announce that we will be having a book chat on Twitter, where Troy will be one of our first co-moderators on September 17th. And that will be 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, 8 o'clock Central Time. And we'll be talking about the technology and how do you get started using the technology and what's out there to use. And we'll try to do that chat once a month, third Tuesday of every month. So put that on your Google Calendar. It's the third Tuesday, 9 o'clock Eastern every month, and we'll talk about one of those chats, and we'll explain and tweet out which chapter each month we're going to be talking about, or chapters. Also, if you go to bit.ly/flipping20, you can buy yourself a copy of the book. Or if you look on many of the authors' websites and blogs, you can find copies there. I'm sure Troy will have something up on his website where you can order it from him. Also available, if you're not comfortable with all of that, also available on Amazon. You just search for Flipping and you can purchase a copy there. And I'm at J. Bretzmann, and my website is Bretzmann Group, BRETZMANN Group.com. And I'd love to hear from you and get an email or tweet from you, and we can connect and keep learning together, because that's really what this is all about. As I say in the introduction, this book is not the definitive end-all to the conversation. This is not exactly how you got to do it. This is a step forward in the conversation, and all of the chapters, at the end of each of the chapters, There's information on how to connect with the authors, either via Twitter or email or their blogs or websites. And that's a way of keeping the conversation going, because we always say, let's keep learning together. And we really believe that.
And I have put it up on my website that you mentioned it. It's at mrcockrum.com/books. It's mrcockrum.com/books, and you can find out how to get it right there. So thank you, Jason, for your time.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
And I believe everything we talked about will be very valuable to the listeners. So
I think you're right. There's a lot of good information, and it's experiences. If anything, the people who share their experiences are experts in their own experiences, and they share a lot of good information. So I hope everybody gets a copy and then shares it with somebody else, because it's going to be a useful tool.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Take care.